In 1893, the eyes of the United States and many from around the world turned to Chicago for the Columbian Exposition World Fair that was designed to celebrate the 400th anniversary of Christopher Columbus' voyage to America. And while this World Fair, which cost $30 million, would result in the construction of over 200 buildings and would contain exhibits from 60 countries and what is now Jackson Park, ended up being a major success. It would be marred by one tragic event, a fire at the cold storage building on July 10th, 1893. Welcome back to the next episode of Fiery Tales, where we talk about historic fires in the United States and around the world and the lessons that we can learn from them. Now, this cold storage building was designed to be a major part of the fair's infrastructure. Basically, there was a need to store all the food that the fair would use for visitors and everyone else that would be associated with the fair during its run. It was also designed with the potential of having an ice skating rink on the roof of this building. Now, the cold storage building itself was 6 stories tall, with all of that under roof being actual storage, and it was topped by a 220-foot iron chimney, because at the time, in order to have cold storage, you needed to have a steam plant complete with a boiler in order to produce the ice and the refrigeration necessary to keep the food at proper temperatures. Now, this stack, like I said, was 220 feet tall, and it was built of either steel or iron, but it was encased in wood. Now, why would a smokestack be encased with wood? Well, at the World's Fair, there was a feeling that all the buildings needed to be decorative and needed to look appealing and kind of like each other. So what happened was this chimney was encased with wood to make it look more decorative and more appealing, to match the white kind of theme of the rest of the World's Fair. And it was even topped by a cupola to make it look like some kind of tower instead of a chimney. The Chicago Tribune, after the fire, would say the building was architecturally a thing of beauty, but due to its construction, it resulted in an awful loss of life. This building was also called the greatest refrigerator on Earth because it was one of the largest. It had been built by the Hercules Iron Works Company, which actually owned the building. And the chief of the World Fair Fire Department said that because of that cupola, he said, "That building is a miserable fire trap and will go up in smoke," end quote. So what was so wrong about this cupola? Well, number one, the cupola was made of wood. Number two, the cupola was incredibly close to the end of the chimney, or the top of the chimney. So some accounts say really less than 10 feet. That distance between, and probably less, between the top of the tower, the top of the chimney, and this cupola. So basically what happens is all of the heat and any sparks or embers and anything come up out of the chimney and hit the cupola. So that's, number one, a major design flaw. The second design flaw, which would prove to be fatal, is the spacing between the chimney and that wooden tower that was constructed around it. And there basically was nothing that prevented the fire or anything else from basically coming back down through that void space from the top or anywhere along the tower to the bottom. Okay, so, and while this building was notable and looked nice and appeared to be some kind of structural marvel, there were issues with it. So in January 1893, when construction first began, an insurance report found that it was filled with faulty wiring and a lack of firewalls. We know on June 17th, a small fire was extinguished in that chimney area. And at some point, it was also condemned by the World's Fair Fire Department and the Chicago Fire Underwriters Association as being unsafe, but it was continued to be used. We also know that at the time of the fire, it was not really completed. The cold storage part was done, but like I mentioned, the ice skating rink and some other things were not yet open. So what happens with a fire? Or, as what the Chicago Tribune calls, quote, a funeral pyre, where individuals were imprisoned by flames, end quote. So what happens is a fire breaks out in this cupola area on July 11th, 1893. It starts just after 1 o'clock in the afternoon when heavy smoke is reported coming from this cupola area. Okay, and we get an initial response of 20 firefighters from the World's Fair Fire Department and the Chicago Fire Department. And what they do, they try to replicate what they had done earlier at the earlier fire, which had occurred about a month before, where they arrive on the scene and try to access this tower. Now, what they first do is put up an extension ladder to the tower to try to get up to it, but the extension ladder was not tall enough to reach the area where the fire was, because basically what they're trying to do is an exterior attack where they're trying to get within range for their hand lines and the pressure to be able to reach the fire. But this extension ladder didn't take them up far enough. So then what happens is they have to get to the top of this tower where there's a ledge around it at this cupola so that they can access a fire. And what they have to do is actually climb the tower. There's like these cleat nails that had been built into it, kind of as steps to let, in case you needed to access it. So these 20 firefighters climb up to the top and access this ledge. Okay, so you got to remember they're about 200 feet in the air, and when they get up there, soon after they arrive, or almost instantaneously after they arrive, it seems, another fire breaks out through this wooden tower about 70 feet below where they're at. So now what's going on is that there's a fire above them in the cupola, and there's a fire 70 feet below. Now what basically had happened was the fire in the cupola had spread down through the void space in the tower and had just basically now emerged down below. Now, probably what had happened was as they were climbing, that fire had been growing, and it just so happens that when they reached the top, unfortunately for them, was when the fire erupted out of the wood part below. Now, these firefighters had taken with them ropes so that they could hoist equipment and hose lines up to fight the fire on the cupola. And what had actually happened, they had already brought up one hose line. And so they had these several ropes, they had these hose lines, and a few firefighters are able to escape, one going down the hose line, and they kind of get down right before it burns through. And then a couple others try to use the rope. But the fire coming out of this tower is so intense that it burns through the rope before they're able to get down. So basically they're now trapped up here on this ledge. And the Chicago Tribune notes that they're basically huddled up there, and it's said that they kind of, quote, resolved to meet it like brave men, end quote, because it's obvious at this point that there's nothing that can be done to get them off. Now, Chief Murphy, who was the chief or acting chief of the World's Fair Fire Department, he directs the other firefighters that are still on the ground to do everything they can to try to rescue these men. And the only way that they could do that would have been to be able to extinguish that fire that was affecting the tower below them. We know that additional resources were called for. Eventually, 21 engine companies from the Chicago Fire Department show up to assist, but there isn't anything they could do in time to make a difference. So basically what's happening is very quickly this fire is now affecting the structural capability or the structural support, the strength of this tower. And the firefighters realize that. They start to try to escape, kind of in a desperate situation. Some of them try to go down these ropes that burn and then break, and they fall to their death. Some jump until eventually there's only 2 firefighters left. One is unidentified who it was, but the other one was Captain James Fitzpatrick, who was actually in charge of the crew that went up. And what he does is he tries to get this unidentified firefighter to go down this one remaining rope, or to go down a rope, and the other firefighter won't go. So Captain Fitzpatrick swings down on this rope that's partially burned, and it burns through as he's coming down, but he's actually, because he's swinging, kind of swings free of the fire and lands on the ground, seriously injured, but he escapes from the fire right before it collapses. And that firefighter who remained, he gets on a rope, but he's too late. What happens is he gets on that rope, the tower then collapses, and he falls into the fire. So he's actually the only one still on this ledge when that wooden tower burns through and collapses. Everyone else fell or jumped or was on a rope or something that burned through. And Captain Fitzpatrick lives for a little bit after this incident, but unfortunately later dies at a hospital as a result from the injuries from this fall. Now, of course, this is in the middle of this giant World's Fair where an estimated 25,000 people come to watch this fire. And we know that over 800 members of the fair security, which was called the Columbia Militia, and 45 U.S. soldiers had to be used to control this crowd, which initially was very enthusiastic in supporting the firefighters, but eventually, when realizing, the tragic loss of life that's happening in front of them, kind of descends into this eerie quiet. And what happens basically is, in the end, 4 Chicago firefighters, 4 firefighters from the Columbian Exposition, 3 civilians die. And 1 other individual perishes, but it's unidentified. It's unknown whether it was a civilian or a Chicago firefighter or a Columbian Exposition firefighter. And that body ends up being unidentified who it even is. So that ends up being, again, 4 Chicago firefighters, 4 Columbian Exposition firefighters, 3 civilians, and 1 unidentified. Out of the 20 firefighters that went up initially. Now, the aftermath of this is the cold storage building is completely destroyed. This fire in the tower wipes out all of the building. The bodies are taken to the World's Fair's morgue, and again, all but 1 are identified. The fire also destroys a stable that was at the cold storage and a Sphinx statue. There are criminal charges of negligence pressed against 4 people, including the architect of the building, Daniel Burnham. But all of these individuals are eventually exonerated. The four people In addition to Burnham were the fair's director of works Edward Murphy, the World's Fair Fire Department chief or fire marshal was Murphy. Burnham was the fair's director of works. John Skinner, president of the Hercules Iron Works, and Charles McDonald, secretary and general manager of the Hercules Iron Works. What happens is, again, they're charged, but almost immediately a grand jury exonerates them because there's no evidence really that their actions purposefully or willfully resulted in the death of the men. McDonald from the Hercules Iron Company blames the fire department for putting its men in danger in a position they knew they couldn't extinguish the fire and not responding fast enough and with enough force to extinguish the fire. But most of the public blame, at least, goes towards the designers of the building, while the city kind of stands behind the fire department and the directors of works and things for the fairgrounds, because they felt that the actual design of the building was what led to the death. Now, officially, no cause was determined for what started the fire. It's rumored it possibly may have been electrical, but it's also just as likely that it involved the cupola and a fire breaking out there as it had the month before. Basically, the cold storage building, the ruins are just removed and it's not replaced. And actually, the next year, the fair buildings, which were by that time really empty, are destroyed in this other fire that basically wipes everything out. Those who died, there's a memorial to them in the Oakwood Cemetery in Chicago. And it's also determined that the contributing factors to the fire were the chimney design, the building construction without the firewalls and things that would have prevented the spread of the fire, air circulation. Boiler size was inappropriate for the building. Equipment style, what was being used, led to massive fire danger. Inadequate emergency resources. 20 firefighters responding to the initial fire was not enough. Equipment overuse. The boilers and the cold storage equipment was really overused at the fair, and overconfidence among the fire department, and the builders, having extinguished the small fire. Even though all these warnings and things, they felt that they would be able to do the same thing again, which they tried in this instance and failed, and unfortunately resulted in a tragic loss of life. This has been just a brief history and discussion of the July 10th, 1893 fire at the Columbian Exposition World Fair at the Cold Storage Building. If you found value in this, I always appreciate a like or a subscribe so you can stay on top of other videos coming out about other historic fires. And if you have any questions or anything else you know about this fire that you want to share or discuss, always drop them down in the comments. I love to hear from those. Hope you enjoyed, and hope you stay tuned for the other videos coming out soon. Have a wonderful day.